I want to introduce myself. My name is Tamarella Kreisworth, and I am one of the founders of the Arizona Ground Game. I see a lot of old faces and some new faces here tonight, and thank you very much for coming. In the beginning, when we started the Arizona Ground Game, we did this kind of thing where we asked people to sit in our legislative district because we want you to get to know the other people in your legislative district. Now, granted, LD9 goes all the way from I-10 to Sabino Canyon, so it's not like it's your next door neighbor. But we are hoping you are going to be our budding activists. Thank you very much, Ellen, for bringing the flowers and reminding everyone how important it is for the work to be done for this election. In LD9, Lori Cinnamon and Jane are here. If you don't mind standing up. Lori and Jane, please introduce yourself to them at the end of the evening. They have been doing an amazing job organizing LD9, and I would love you to get to know them and for them to help you in your actions. Sure. Well, if you want to.
I just want to say, anyone in LD9, if you're not already signed up to volunteer, if you go on our website, ld9dems.com, there's a thing up at the top that says get involved, and if you go down to the menu where it says volunteer and fill out an online volunteer form, we'll get you plugged in right away. So.
Thank you. And LD10 is over here. I'm looking for Bonnie Heidler. I don't see it. Maybe, Marion, do you want to say it? No? No. So we're waiting. Bonnie Heidler and Elizabeth Packard should be here for LD10, and they'll talk to you a little bit about the organizing there. And then LD2 and LD3 is over here. Gina, you just took a bite of a cookie. Gina is doing the organizing in LD3. She's sitting behind you guys. And then LD11, we don't have a personal representative from LD11 and people from out of town. So we just want you guys to introduce yourselves to each other, get to know each other, because the Arizona Ground Game is all about organizing together within your neighborhoods. And we can't do it on our own, so everybody needs a partner to do it. Much time has been put into the packets that you have. So the packets that you have, the yellow sheet, we're hoping you'll fill that out and drop it off before you leave. The blue sheet is a little bit of information about the Arizona Ground Game, and the back side of that sheet talks about the neighborhood organizing that we have been working on 2 years, this formula that we've been working on for 2 years. It shows you a little sample of what it's all about. And then our esteemed guests asked us to print the next 2 pages. So you have some pages about immigration, streamlining, and some talking points. So it's really, it's not something we just put together very quickly. It took a lot of time and effort, and it's really important information. We have a lot to cover. I don't see very many candidates here tonight, which is surprising. Are there any candidates here tonight? I'm surprised. So usually we'll have candidates. If they do come later, I will ask them to introduce themselves to you. One of the things, so let me tell you, who knows about the Arizona Ground Game? Wow, a lot of you guys. Well, it's quick. I won't go into it too much, though. For those that are not familiar with you, we are a Desert Roots organization of volunteers. Everyone that works with us is a volunteer. There is no money that changes hands, and our whole mode of operation is for us to build relationships in our neighborhoods, because if we build relationships in our neighborhoods, the multi-millions of dollars of advertising about fake information is not going to mean as much to a voter as much as our interaction with our neighbor is going to mean. We'll have an opportunity to speak to our neighbor about the things that we learn at the forums, and about the propositions, which is going to be incredibly important. There are going to be some propositions. I don't know does anybody know how many propositions are going to be on the ballot this year? I mean, it's not finished yet, but a lot. Some are yes, some are no. So it's really, really important that we inform our neighbors about that. And we have the formula. All you have to do is plug yourself in. We have the maps, the packets, everything. All we're asking for yourself is to plug in. What we're going to do between now and Election Day is every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, location to be named, we are going to make ourselves available 2 hours each of those days for you can come and get trained. So you can come and learn about the packets, you can learn about minivan. That information will be mailed out. This banner right here, we had a forum about the tax giveaways, and this banner is only 190 so of the 300 and something giveaways. And this is tax giveaways of money that does not end up in our coffers. So for instance, if Rob here owned a private jet, he could park that private jet for basically free. And that's $6 million that doesn't go into our bank. If he wants to buy fuel for that jet, that's another $6 million that he gets a tax break on for owning a private jet. Do you get a break for your car or your garage? And so there's a bunch of other tax giveaways, and it was an amazing forum, and there's information on our website about it. It's just disgusting that some of these people get these tax giveaways. We pay our fair share in taxes, so should everybody else. So that's what this is a sample of. I know there's a lot in the news today regarding Manafort and Cohen. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more in the next couple of days, but tonight I would like you all to focus on the immigration. There's a lot of great information, and it's a devastating thing that we've become subhuman in the treatment of other people. There's a candidate. Hello, Bruce. We'd ask candidates to stand up. Would you mind standing up and letting us know about you? Bruce Wheeler, running for CD2. So I'm going to hand it off to Rob Williams, to Marlene. Marlene's going to introduce everybody. And just real quick, I want to let you know that when my grandfather came here on the ship called the something Grant in 1907. And so I am an immigrant, and I'm going to bet that almost everybody in this audience is an immigrant. And we need to think about how we feel we should be treated. So Marlene.
Hi, welcome everybody. I think most people in this, many people in this room probably know me. I'm going to be really brief, but I want to follow up a little bit on what Mary said, only because I think Tamarella was probably going to say this at the end of the forum, but I'm going to say it now. We are going to have regular meeting times for anybody in the ground game who's interested in getting together and learning how to call, canvass, write postcards. We're going to have it at the same place 3 times a week, 3 different places every week until the election. And we're inviting Mary to come to those meeting places. So if anybody wants to come instead of to that workshop at the Salt of the Earth to learn how to write letters, they can do that as well. So, you know, we had sent out on our MailChimp 30 things that you can do as a volunteer to make sure the vote happens and that we turn the election blue in the midterm. So these are ways to help do that. Okay, it's my privilege to introduce these 3 great people here. I'm going to start with Rob. He's the moderator. He is a Regents Professor. Is it a Regents Professor? Yes. He's a Regents Professor at the University of Arizona, the co-director of the Indigenous Studies program there, and internationally recognized as a legal expert and expert on Indigenous issues internationally. And I've known him since my daughter and his daughter were on the same t-ball team. Really a long time. The next person I want to introduce is Isabel Garcia, who I'm sure most people in the audience know, who I knew back when the sanctuary movement started, which is really a long time ago, when we were both very young. And I still had long hair, but she still does. Isabel has been incredibly active in the human rights community. She was an assistant public defender and a federal public defender as well, particularly focusing on immigration issues and immigration rights, border issues, militarization of the border, and then went into private practice where she's been working until 2015. No?
I was, for 22 and a half years, the director of the Pima County Legal Defenders.
Right.
And my side job, my hobby is Derechos Humanos.
Okay, right.
But that was my day job.
That was her day job. She's incredibly hardworking, has won numerous awards. And finally, there's Billy Parrott, who's a Tucson native, who's returned to Tucson to be the bilingual lawyer for the ACLU. He worked in Georgia on labor rights and labor issues for the ACLU, and right now he's here to help us all and help immigration by the ACLU.
Ron.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to the Arizona Ground Game Forum on what the organizers have called the child separation fiasco. How did we get here? And maybe after tonight's discussion, we can shed some light on both the background and the history and the contemporary urgency of this situation that confronts us here on the border. I'm basically going to get out of the way and let the two experts who I've known their work and the impact of their work and the commitment that they've put toward this issue makes them really two of the most respected authorities, not only in Tucson, but in the Southwest to address this issue. So I really feel honored to be able just to sit back and learn from these two committed human rights advocates. What I'd like to do is hand over the mic to Isabel and to Billy, and they've agreed to start a dialogue, perhaps giving us a little bit of background and history. And I think it'll be interesting to sort of watch these two minds at work, help educate us. Hope we have some time. We should have some time at the end, maybe after about 30 or 40 minutes, to open up to questions from the audience. So with that said, let's open the forum, and I hand the mic over to Isabel and to Billy. Thank you very much.
There's two microphones. So the title is the family separation fiasco crisis. But when Isabel sat down to prepare our remarks for tonight, we actually decided we're not going to spend the bulk of our time discussing family separation specifically. So you're not going to hear that term a lot during our prepared remarks. And our hope is that throughout, as the evening goes on, you all will begin to understand why that is, and why the topic that we are going to devote the bulk of our time to, we both feel is and has been the root cause, if there is such a thing as a root cause, perhaps the closest thing to a root cause of where we find ourselves today over the past 6 months under the Trump administration's policies of family separation, and what allowed over time for this to happen. And of course, at the end, we're happy to talk more specifically about family separation, but just to lay the groundwork. Does anyone have any sense of what if you could pick out of your hat one single crime out of all the crimes that exist in the United States, the one single crime that represents the largest number of people prosecuted? Any guesses?
Drugs?
I hear a lot of drugs. Immigration?
Specifically?
And there's one specific crime. If you have all the hundreds and hundreds of laws. Sure. Isabel's going to act out. Are we going to keep guessing?
I think it's driving.
Oh, okay. So of all the crimes that are prosecuted in the United States, there's one crime.
Crossing the border.
There you go, crossing the border, which is what we call illegal entry and illegal re-entry, which is essentially one law, one specific law of the hundreds of laws that are on the hundreds of criminal laws that are on the books in states and under federal law. That is the single most pervasive crime prosecuted in terms of numbers of people. So keep that in mind. That is by virtue of a statute that we're going to refer to by the number, because one of the things we do want you to walk away from tonight is to know the number. I don't typically emphasize the number of a law, but this one I hope is ingrained in your mind by the end of tonight. It's Section 1325 and Section 1326 of Title 8 of the United States Code. We lawyers refer to it as 8 U.S.C. 1325 for short, or just 1325. You can just remember that part, 1325. Okay, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. I'm not going to give you any context. See if you can guess when these quotes arose. There are conditions created by the incoming of people from Mexico and other American countries which it was and is the purpose of the immigration laws to prevent. The law is poorly enforced, mainly because the appropriation made for the Border Patrol are not adequate. There are great sections under that present provision that cannot be adequately guarded. There are many interested in the importation of these poor peons. They are often imported and left in pitiful conditions. In fact, there are hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Americans out of employment now. They are raising a serious race question. During this month, a riot occurred, etc., etc. This Congress ought to have the statesmanship enough in it to look over the past and see what grave problems have been injected into our national life by the importation for labor purposes of great numbers of people, essentially different in character from us.
Wow.
Any guesses on when that was?
1930.
Those are good guesses. Kind of sounds like some people today, but that was from 1929, so those are some good guesses I heard. And that was the legislative debate on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1929 when they passed what I'm now referring to as Section 1325. So the law that is now responsible for the greatest single number of prosecutions throughout this country, you just heard one of the key debates, or one of the key speeches in that debate when they passed that law. It's irrefutable that this law was rooted in a racist mentality and was specifically targeted to one specific race. And it is being implemented day in and day out in federal courthouses throughout the United States, and most particularly the federal courthouse here in Tucson. And I should add that it's not just border counties or border states that prosecute. There are 94 federal districts. The country is divided up into 94 kind of administrative districts for court purposes. And of the 94, a recent study showed that 90 of them, including places like Alaska or North Dakota, had prosecuted people under this particular provision. But of course, here in Arizona, it tops out at well over half of all prosecutions in the federal courthouse in downtown Tucson. In fact, I think in Tucson specifically, it's closer to 75%. And if you just narrow it down to the Tucson courthouse by itself. So think of that. Think about all the other crimes that our federal government is responsible for enforcing. Things like what Mr. Manafort was just charged with, or just convicted of today, and what Mr. Cohen was charged with today. And the range of things like corruption and tax fraud and financial crimes and murder and sexual assault and kidnapping across state lines, and all the types of federal crimes that the federal government is responsible for. And here in Tucson, all of those combined are less than half of the amount of resources put into enforcing that one law that Isabel just acted out. I do want to talk briefly about the difference between civil and criminal law, because that sometimes gets mixed up when we talk about immigration. If someone is in this country without what we call lawful status, it could mean that they're subject to civil offense, and it could mean they're subject to a criminal offense, or it could mean that they're subject to both, some combination of the two. The civil offense is not a crime. Being in this country without proper documentation is not, strictly speaking, a crime. It's the act that Isabel acted out, the act of crossing, which could be a crime. So that's an important distinction. Some studies show that about 40% of people who lack proper documentation in this country came here on an airplane or some other lawful means and overstayed their visa. But the other 60% did at some point in time, maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was 25 years ago, at some point about 60% of those people did theoretically commit a crime. But it's ultimately up to the powers that be to determine how aggressively they'll enforce that crime. We can think of all kinds of crimes on the books, on the local level or on the federal level, that still exist, but are not aggressively pursued, because most people with a thinking mind realize that it's a ridiculous law and not worth the expenditure of our resources to enforce. But that's not apparently what our recent society has chosen. They've decided it is worth a huge expenditure of our resources. So much so, does anyone remember John Roll, Judge John Roll?
Yeah.
He was assassinated in 2011, the same shooting that took Gabby Giffords. And he said before he passed, yes, thank you. Isabel clarified that Gabby is still alive, but was injured. John Roll said, if Operation, we're going to talk about Operation Streamline, but if Operation Streamline were fully implemented, you would take the resources now for the entire country, double it, and put all that just in one state, Arizona. That's a nice way of summing up the financial resources that our system decides is worthy of devoting to this one, enforcing this one single 1929 racist law. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Isabel, who's going to take us up more to the present moment.
Okay. So thank you so much to the Arizona Ground Game for holding this event, for holding all the events, the educational forums. I don't care where you are, the most important things we can do. It is so important because if you're not informed, you really are not a great constituent, citizen, whatever you want to call yourself, right? So I really thank you for doing these, and especially for bringing this particular issue to board, because the question is, how is it that we got here till this child crisis, right? I mean, and so then I'll go back from there. How did we get to this child crisis? As Billy said, it's been long in the making, and nobody knows. Nobody knows in Tucson, Arizona. The vast majority of the people in Tucson, Arizona have not a clue what happens in the federal court here in Tucson, Arizona. And I tell you because I go to many places and ask the question, and people have no idea what goes on in the federal court. So I really think it's the issue of the day. And as horrible as this child crisis was, is, and continues to be, it gives us the opportunity and responsibility to attack why it happened. How was it that it happened? And so, yes, we began racist, beginnings and such, but we've treated it as an administrative proceeding, just like Social Security and many other other administrative proceedings. So immigrants are caught up in an administrative proceeding and potentially in a criminal proceeding. And unfortunately, Border Patrols, because they have administrative and criminal, many times don't even respect rights of self-incrimination, for instance. And so, therefore, we've got, first of all, this agency that acts both administratively and now being pushed to act in a criminal thing. So, we started in 2005, really, with Operation Streamline in Del Rio, Texas. Because I had been a Reggie Fellow lawyer in Del Rio, Texas, and I had married a guy from there, I had family, and they told me, Isabel, they're building a brand new federal court. Federal prison. And I thought, oh my God, and it was huge. They described it to me. They kept telling me and I told them, they're going to prosecute people for illegal entry. You mark my words. What was going on at that time? Because you have to have context in all of this, right? What was going on at the time? There was mass exodus of people from Mexico, right? The UN Rapporteur on Migrant Rights, Jorge Bustamante, stated in 2009 that over 6 million subsistence farm workers and the little outlying economies had literally picked up and illegally crossed into the US, right? So that was going on. 2005 is when they began mass prosecution, and they told 100 people, 180 people, they said, it's going to have a consequence. So the consequence delivery system was, implemented by a president I voted for twice. Prevention through deterrence policy, Southern Border Strategy, whatever you want to call it, in the midst of the impact of NAFTA. NAFTA impacted, subsistence farm work in such a way that there was a mass exodus, and of course the Zapatistas came about. And he also did another terrible thing. He did IRA, I forget exactly what the name spells out, but it imposed further restrictions on immigrants' ability to fight deportation, to be able to get legalization through their U.S. citizen, for instance, sponsors abroad, made it much more difficult to fight deportation. So that was the context. Those three things. And so in 2005, they started Operation Streamline, and let me tell you, it's not as if we hadn't been really, in a sense, streamlining already, a little bit here in the court. This court, when we started Streamline in 2008, and I was there in the courtroom, we already had that same courtroom, that courthouse. That courthouse had been built. We had been bringing in immigrants, 10 at a time and 20 at a time, and they'd go up to Eloy, and then 3 days later they'd come and waive, preliminary hearings, they'd enter a plea, and they'd get sentenced. And so they stopped with that charade, and they made it a real charade, a real kangaroo court, where you just come in, and a criminal process that has its very essential and important phases. As a criminal defense attorney, I can tell you, we have mass incarceration, we have racial disparity, we have all of that. But yet, we have a criminal justice system that guarantees you these very important parts, constitutionally guaranteed. And we make immigrants, people who are, don't understand our system, to come in, and in one fell swoop, in 1 hour, 2 hours now, because they're doing them 7 at a time here. It's taking a little longer, but it was within 1 hour. One judge boasted, doing them in 35 minutes to go through an entire criminal process, waiving the entire thing. Waivers of rights are very important, and you have to make sure. And so, anyway, what we began on January the 8th, I believe, 16th of 2008, was really meant for the Tucson court, because the Tucson sector of the Border Patrol by then was the #1 sector. They had at least 1,000 people coming in through this sector alone. They'd arrest massive numbers. There was 2,000 coming in, 1,000 being arrested, and they said we're going to do zero tolerance, and they didn't do zero tolerance because, as Judge Roll stated, it would bankrupt us completely, but they did partial zero tolerance, and so they began doing 70 people per day, 70 people in one court per day, right? Monday through Friday, except if there's naturalization ceremonies and the like. And Operation Streamline is, as the word denotes, it's streamlined. Instead of having initial appearance and followed by, probable cause determination, hearing that we hear, then set up for trial, set up for hearings, investigation, legal research, win hearings, lose hearings, go to trial, lose trial, win trial. None of that happens because it's done. And if you haven't gone to see the court, you must go to see the court, right? It's really essential that you know the implications, the cost, but you must see what it looks like. When we had 70 people at once, it was really so appalling that when we would bring delegations, especially when we brought the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, most of them walked out because they couldn't stomach the sound of the chains and all of it. Too reminiscent for them. Because of litigation, there was a stop to the chaining inside the court, and so they chained and changed, and so now they bring in groups of 7 to 10. I haven't been in the court in the last couple of weeks, but it takes a little bit longer, but nonetheless, It's streamlined justice, supermarket justice really is what I would call it. And so there's a lot to talk about, but you need to know not only what the crime is, right? And we talked about the misdemeanor. And when I was a little tiny federal public defender and they had a few of these cases, I would win the cases because the only way they could prove the crime was through the statements of my clients, who I told you they had violated the rights, and the statements were taken in violation of Miranda throughout the statements, and therefore they didn't have a case. But what about the felony? Do you know what the felony requires? Felony says that if I'm found right here at Pueblo High School, and in the records they find that I've been formally deported, even though that I may not know I was formally deported through the expedited removal process. Some immigrants don't know they were formally deported. But if you have that, that's it, that's the felony. Is that an easy felony to prove or what? Fastest growing felony in this country. Isn't that interesting? While I remember there was an article about Native Americans objecting to some of the very serious child abuse, kidnapping, other cases not being prosecuted, and yet they were prosecuting these cases. You need to know the incarceration rate is almost 99% for that crime. Almost 99% for that crime. And we cannot lose sight of why people come, right? It's really important to know why people come, and that we know why people come, because otherwise people make assumptions and believe Trump and believe the headlines about why people come. And you know, we have a lot of gall to say people shouldn't come when we've allowed U.S. policies. I'm guilty too, we've allowed U.S. policies to impact nations that are now in mass exodus from their own countries, and now we want to put walls because we don't want them as evidence either of our wrongdoing. So when it was announced, of course, on what was it, on April the 6th or something, that they were going to do zero tolerance, of course, it was an outrage. We knew it was going to be horrific. And so, of course, pretty quick, we had over 2,000 children being separated and the like. And we said, they said the Justice Department can't prosecute children along with parents. So the natural result of zero tolerance policy has been a sharp rise in family separations. Nearly 2,000 immigrant children were separated from parents during 6 weeks in April and May, according to DHS. So we hear this, but the track, which is that you need to look for, is the transaction. I always forget.
Transaction Records Access Clearinghouse.
Yes. They sued, they did a FOIA and they sued to get the information. And what's appalling upon looking at their information, and you should look it up, is that not only was it not zero tolerance, but they chose to pick on the families. There were many, many single adults. You can look at the charts. There were many single adult men that were subject to zero tolerance, were not prosecuted, and therefore somebody still had prosecutorial discretion. It wasn't zero tolerance at all. And so it's CBP personnel that have made these referrals. Arizona took every single referral. So, maybe I'll give it back to Billy here.
Let's see. So what do y'all think we talked about the ostensibly the racial motivation in 1929. What would be a guess of what the modern day justification for this law is, or the modern day justification to keep this law and to keep enforcing this law?
Money.
Money? What's that? I'm sorry? You can yell loud.
Economy.
Economy?
Crime.
What does
Crime.
say?
What if we have to pick a kind of a 21st century acceptable justification? Can't be racism because that's not acceptable. Security. One of the things I hear the most is deterrence. That you criminalize something, right? You criminalize in part to punish, but you also criminalize in part to deter that same person and future people like them from committing that same action. That's oftentimes the thing we hear about in the penological theory world. Well, in the case of Section 1325, it's been debunked. There's zero deterrence effect. You can put someone in prison for 2, 3, 4 years for the act of crossing, as Isabel acted out, and that is not shown to deter that person or any other people from their community from doing the same. And we can imagine why, right? Because immigration is unlike other types of criminal activity that we try to deter. It's motivated oftentimes by necessity, by need, by trying to reunify yourself with your family. Maybe your family, in many cases, your family lives in the U.S. And we also find increasingly that many of them come not necessarily to seek out a better life in the sense of financial life, but they come to seek out a better life in the sense of escaping almost certain death and violence in their home country. And so we call those folks typically asylum seekers. And there's not good numbers on this, but my best guess, my best estimate, based on a few different sources kind of put together in my head, is that conservatively between 20 and 30% of border crossers in Arizona specifically, so those who are apprehended in the Arizona portion of the desert, are what international law would define as asylum seekers. Now, is it legal to prosecute someone for the act of coming into a new country when their motivation for coming into that country is to escape violence in their home country? Is that legal?
No.
Well, I would agree with you, but the federal courts so far don't. There's a 1951 and a 1967 treaty that the U.S. belongs to. Back when the U.S. Senate was still in the business of ratifying treaties, which I don't think they've done now for quite some time, but back in the years when they were still in the business of ratifying treaties, they ratified this one, the 1967 Protocol on the Status of Refugees. And Article 31 of that treaty, to which we belong, basically says that thou shalt not penalize, that's the word they use, shall not penalize an asylum seeker for the act of entering. The act that Isabel acted out earlier. And yet we do it on a daily basis. They in the Tucson courthouse and in all federal courthouses throughout the country, there's no screening process. They're not trying to avoid prosecuting people who might be asylum seekers. They prosecute, they might weed people out based on their family status, as Isabel described, and maybe prosecuting more heavily those who come as family units, but they certainly don't take it easy on those who meet the definition of asylum. To date, that has not, I hope someday that will be challenged in a meaningful way in the court of law, but to date it has not. And part of the reason U.S. law, part of the reason why U.S. authorities are allowed to prosecute asylum seekers is because we ratified the treaty in 1968. But can anyone guess how long it took the U.S. Congress to pass a law implementing the 1967 obligations? It was 1980. It was the waning days of the Carter administration. Congress finally passed the Refugee Act of 1980, which codified, which put into U.S. domestic law many of the provisions of that treaty relating to asylum, and that's how we got our current adjudicative system that asylum seekers have to go through in order to apply for asylum, and et cetera, et cetera. But there's one part of our treaty obligations that Congress did not see fit in 1980 to codify into domestic law. Any guesses on what that was? Article 31, the article that says you can't penalize people. So that part was never codified. They never changed the language of the old 1929 law. So the old 1929 law still exists, the same as it did in 1929. There was no, Congress didn't think, or maybe they did think, and deliberately chose not to modify Section 1325 to ensure that there was no conflict with the treaty obligation. And so here we are in 2018, and we routinely prosecute, including here in Tucson, asylum seekers. And if you ask the U.S. Attorney, the federal prosecutors here in Tucson, and Isabel and I have, Chris Lewis, right? And they say, our legal analysis is it's not a violation of Article 31. They all know about Article 31. When you ask them, they can converse with you about the requirements of Article 31, and then they'll look at you straight in the eyes and they'll say, that doesn't apply to these guys, though. That's not. Oh, right, and then there was an OIG report 3 years ago? 2 years ago? There was an Office of Inspector General, one of the investigative arms of the U.S. government, that performed a somewhat neutral analysis of the system, and there was a quote in that report that said something like, it is our assessment that Article 31 is likely being violated on a routine basis. So,
the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that in Arizona we've had senators that have not only supported Streamline, but have demanded for the growth of Streamline. The last bipartisan bill in the Senate included, in an almost 1,000-page proposed bill, it included a section stating that the Streamline Court in Tucson, Arizona, at the Evo DeConcini District Court, located at such and such, should be increased threefold. 3 courtrooms a day at $70 apiece. That was the recommended last bipartisan grand bill. Remember that everybody was allegedly in favor of, which we weren't. That wasn't passed. That was included in there. So we've got a really tough one. The senator, when he was Senator Kyle, and both Senators Flake and McCain are adamantly opposed to any effort to stop Streamline. They've both made resolutions to the Senate when Yuma was not engaged in Streamline because the U.S. Attorney determined that it was ridiculous to do. They had a lot of pressure from local sheriff and other people, and so they went to bat on this issue over and over and over, demanding and stating that migration had in fact fallen in Yuma because of Streamline, which is absolutely ridiculous. We know that the economy hit bottom, and that's what really caused that. So anyway, we've got that problem here in Arizona, and we also have to ask ourselves why we're doing this. Just in the back of our minds, why are we doing this? I think there are some answers. We all, we've criminalized so many people in this country, and we hate criminals. It's the only person you can lawfully discriminate against is a criminal. So we criminalize them. Even some of our own champs on Frontline said, 63% of them that have been deported were criminals. Well, the crime being illegal entry. So we've criminalized them. But once you criminalize somebody, it's hard to convince your aunt to support a criminal alien, right? That's what they call them. So we have to understand that was part of the intent, to blame and criminalize them. The other thing is we've got to understand this is part of the growing militarization of the border. And it's what I call the least known aspect of the militarization of the border is what goes on in those federal courts. And we've had the creation and growth, and in some cases creation of private industry that has responded to the dramatic increase of incarcerated migrants. Did we really think that the private industry was going to sit on their hands when the states of New York, California, Illinois said, oh my goodness, we're incarcerating too many people, spending too much money on prisons? So of course it was the migrants. I mean, that was a growing thing. So the growth of that private industry is really frightening. Sessions has never revealed how much stock he has in CoreCivic. It was Corrections Corporation of America, now CoreCivic. And they usually have no bid contracts, and they have guaranteed quotas. My grandson was sick the other day and he missed school, and I thought, Jesus, Bonillas is going to be docked I don't know how many dollars because he was sick and he was not. Do you know that if they don't fill these private prisons, do you think they go missing? They get deducted? No. They have passed, and it was Brady, I think, who did it, has quotas. So we have to guarantee payment for these prison beds.
Yeah, and I think it would help if you were able to explain why somebody being prosecuted under 1325 would agree to their lawyer's advice to participate in Streamline, some of the pressures that are on those involved and why they might not fight these charges, and also addressing the issue of the legal industrial complex that's grown up around Streamline, and not only just the prison industrial complex, but the legal culture of the entire city is warped by participation, and maybe talk about how that works.
Yeah, we have, so the Tucson, as Isabel mentioned, I mean, the Tucson federal court is quite a job creator, going to the question of the topic of the legal industrial criminalization complex, if you want to call it that. The federal courthouse in Tucson is a pretty large job generator, more so than other federal courts. In fact, I believe Phoenix, which has a population about quadruple that of the Tucson metro area, has fewer public defenders in their system, fewer prosecutors in their system, than we do here in the Tucson federal court. And why is that?
1325.
Exactly. It's that one law. It's that one statute that makes Tucson a much larger court operation than a city 4 times our size in population. We have about 150 contract lawyers because in our system, since 1963, the government is required constitutionally to provide representation. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one will be provided to you. That part, that little line. Yeah, that translates in Tucson to about 150 private contract lawyers that the U.S. government has to contract in order to discharge their constitutional duty to provide lawyers to these 70 to 100 people a day that are funneled through the Tucson courthouse. And they make good money, far more than Isabel and I have ever made, I'm sure. And I think it's way upwards of $100,000 a year that each of those attorneys earns. And not to mention the cost of the prosecuting attorneys, that's a whole other cost. The cost of the U.S. Marshals, which is the courtroom security. My understanding is that there's a medical industrial complex involved in this because all detainees must go through TB testing and screening before they can enter the federal courthouse. That's a federal courthouse rule. So all these different government employees and private contractors of the government all benefit, to get to Rob's question. And then the second question he posed was, why would somebody plead to this? And I'll give my insight, and then Isabel will give hers. And but the power dynamics are incredible. The maximum penalty. Does anyone know what the maximum penalty might be for the act of doing what Isabel just did?
2 years imprisonment.
What's that?
2 years imprisonment.
2 years? Yes, for the first time you do it. Let's say you do it a second time.
20.
20. 20 years is the maximum. And you might say to yourself, well, yeah, it's a maximum of 20 on paper, but no one actually gets that, right? Like, that doesn't actually really happen. Wrong. I actually talked to somebody today at the federal prison on Wilmot Road, one of the staff, and she was telling me about one of the inmates that she was dealing with there at that facility, and that he was there on a 1326 violation, and that he was serving a 10-year term. 10-year term. For nothing else. He didn't kill anyone, he didn't shoot anyone, he didn't have any, it was a victimless crime. The act of walking across an invisible line, or these days not so invisible line.
I want to talk a little bit about the original intent. As I told you, during that time we had mass exodus of farm workers in Mexico. Because of the southern border strategy, they created the funnel through Arizona, and the Tucson sector was the most trafficked. And you can look at the newspapers, they're quoted over and over and over saying, our intent is to have a little deterrent, a consequence. It's called the consequence delivery system, euphemistic, right? So we want to give them a little slap on the wrist for the first time entrance so that they never come again. So this program allegedly was first time entrance, right? Because we had mass exodus from the ejidos and whatever. So that was their alleged intent. So then 2008 happened, 2007, 8, 9 happened. And so you would think we would shut down Streamline. Well, that's what Yuma did. The U.S. attorney at that time shut down Streamline, and of course the local interests weren't happy, but they should have said, we don't need Streamline anymore, because our intent was to give them a little slap on the wrist for first time entrance so that they break themselves of their smuggling habits. I mean, they never acknowledge in their Border Patrol strategic plan the real reasons people come, right? I mean, it's to break them. At one point in the paper, one of our chiefs said, we think we have found it. 45 days is the ideal time to give them, to break them of this. Really? If your family is in the state of Washington, 45 days in prison is going to stop you? So we saw clearly that their intent was just hogwash, right? They just wanted to do mass prosecution. So pretty soon, it became better in a sense for the lawyers. You felt a little better because almost everybody coming forward were people who had been previously deported and therefore facing the felonies. And if you're facing the felony of what I just told you, sitting here and they have a record, and really, I'm never going to get a pardon. It didn't matter who would intervene. I'm never going to get a pardon for my deportation. What's my defense? I mean, you can be creative, but who has time to be creative that way when they're offering you Streamline? So what they substituted all the first-time entrants, or for the most part, with people who were trying to come back to their families. And so you offer them a plea of misdemeanor versus a guaranteed 2 years, or you negotiate at least down, 18 months. I mean, I've seen people negotiate to 72 months, 54 months in the felony arena. And so it's a horrific, waste of money, waste of humanity. I remember at one point being invited to the efforts of the postal workers trying to stop the closing of the post office that cost $14 million a year, 300 good jobs, vital service, 14 million a year. The U.S. Marshal told me that he was writing a $17 million check per month. Do we get that? I think we need to do charts. You're right, with the charts. He told me, David Gonzalez told me, we're paying a $17 million check to CCA per month. Not 14 million that we needed for the post office, 17 million per month, and nobody's batting an eye. Because we don't, locally, from that courthouse alone. Yes. David Gonzalez. He said himself at that time, I don't know if he would be as candid these days, but he said it was an incredible waste of money. He said it in front of a lot of reporters when it first started. So I just wanted to let you know that Arizona, the most prosecutions during May, you know, this child kidnapping case, almost 4,000 occurred in South District, Texas alone. Imagine that, in McAllen, Texas. We in Tucson had the largest number of recorded prosecutions during April, 1,392, and in May it fell to 1,149. So you can look at all of these charts even in more detail if you look at the track report. It's pretty troubling, especially when you read that they prosecuted only 32% of the eligible to be deported single adults, male adults.
And again, the reason for that would be that the presumption
Can't
is...
hear you.
The reason for that would be the presumption is that many of these males are in the workforce as opposed to families, or what do you think the reasoning is for the prosecution of those?
I want to know. I want to know. How dare we abuse children? We still have hundreds that are without their parents. I can't even think. I can't even talk because it's an outrage that CBP focused. They knew what Sessions wanted. Why did they focus on dividing children? This report will tell you that some of the people, so many adults also had their children taken away and they were not even prosecuted. So they were focusing in on doing this.